my name is Natalia Zuluaha. I've been in Miami since 1985 and I came here from Colombia. I work primarily as a curator in contemporary art and in publishing art books. But publicity is a machine that drives so many things now in this era in terms of the developing city, right? So the way in which cities compete with each other nowadays is as much to do with their image as what they're known for. And I think Miami sort of positioning itself, or it being positioned as like ground zero, is both an apocalyptic overdetermination, right? At the same time as it is an opportunity for the city to kind of present itself in terms of as a leader. Like there was this thing going back to the intertitle thing where like Miami is like a leader in being submerged, right? And as a result, like has the investment tools, has the real estate tools, has like the financial imagination of tax bases, right? That it will be first to have to deal with those things in ways that other now global cities in this era do. We're not talking about the cities like Jakarta. We're not talking about, we're not talking about that. We're talking about other kinds of cities within, let's say, primary powers like the United States, right? In terms of economic forethought. So yeah, do I see it? Yeah, I think my experience here, just seeing the way in which local governments are responding to it, the way it's both a polarized issue on a national level, but it's not really here, right? Like it's sort of accepted here, but it's like how you deal with it, that's a different kind of polarized position. I think something else happens here too. Like there's a couple of like things out there right now where it's just like imagine the end. Like write essays about what you imagine the end to be like. Or like what will you miss the most about Miami? Elegies about Miami's death. And it's like I find those things jarring personally, not because I don't think that the reality, I think the reality that we're living in is a real reality, but I also find those things having some kind of priorities misplaced in a way, because the critical perspective or the critical lens on it doesn't go toward like how is this image of Miami being used and who does it affect actually down the line, and like what are the implications for urban spaces and the people who occupy those urban spaces. They go toward a kind of misuse of like cultural capital in order to reinforce those very ideas. So I think it happens on all of those. In terms of engineering, even like actually engineers approach to the problems at hand, like king tides, right? And like rising water, and all of these are actually pragmatic. Like they're using existing infrastructures to do it. So like it's not about they're missing the financial arc, the long arc, in order to really invest in projects at the scale in which they need to be, right? Invested at. But like the Keys, for example, the first priority is actually raising the main roads out of the Keys. Because like they were not talking yet here about like the nooks and crannies of communities, right? I mean, I know that we are in some ways, but like in terms of like real infrastructural change, like from what I understand, or the limits of what I understand, is that they're still at that first level, like raising the roads to get people out of neighborhoods and in high waters is the first priority. It's like what you're saying, like keeping the windows clean and like making sure there's not a single palm frond on the ground. Like those are the water pumps, right? The water pumps are not a permanent solution to the real reality of what this community will probably face. But that's kind of the thing that it's in place, and I feel like that's what engineers and what small municipalities are, how they're responding. So those big projects, like all of that big money and all of that research money, or having the 100 mayors or the 100 resilient cities conference happen here, it's all image. It's all for the image of Miami being at the front lines, but you're right. When you drive through this city, you're like, not much is changing in terms of how these things get adapted, right? It's like, not condoning smart grids or anything like that, but it's like none of these things are being applied in that sense. Nor do I see it actually being applied in the next 10 years. No. Yeah, I think in the nitty-gritty question of things, like, there's a huge tax-based problem with the idea of water rising here, Miami Beach specifically, right? Like, you lose the sort of real estate value of those properties, and you lose a huge tax base of what happens here. I don't think they have a solution that isn't really funny. It isn't at the individual level. Like, I've seen those individual walls that people are putting in their homes, like those seawalls in their houses in some places, and some businesses on South Beach are actually doing it too. But it's not a city thing. It's still on this hyper individual, like, survival this thing on that. So people, they're provisional, right? So they're not there all the time. They're like slats that get put on there, and they're happening in like these brand new, concrete block, beautiful, like Category 5 hurricane resistant homes. But they're not happening. There's nothing of that thinking. And this is not to say that I don't know what should happen. To be honest, I have spent time thinking about it, but I don't think I've landed anywhere. But like, there's no thinking about that in a neighborhood scale. I mean, here education is both a class and a racial segregation that happens here, like based on tax bases. Like, there are already islands in that sense, and municipalities like Coral Gables, Coconut Grove, Miami Beach, which are like high income areas in particular, for sure. I mean, there are politicians in this community who really think that the answer to this is actually creating 5 or 6 islands, right? Of like survivor areas, like where gigantic high rises exist, and where you have a combination of like working class and high class in order to maintain your tax base, and that everything else goes to shit. And that's the imaginary that they're also sort of creating, and like not laying down. They're laying down the legislation for you, or even the plan, but they're laying out the words in order for that to be like the only thing that people can imagine as a solution, or like as a future reality of this place. And maybe I'm old school like this, but it's just like in those scenarios, nobody ever thinks about the people on their rooftop. Like, nobody thinks about that moment of transition of just like, if people have to leave these communities after a catastrophic event, for example, why is it that the imagination of politicians and mayors in this community first go toward those high rises, but we don't think about, like, nobody thinks about the unrest and the difficulties, right? Nobody wants to, but like the vast majority of Miami-Dade County is not affluent, right? And like, so it's like the cultural imaginary, the political imaginary around that future is one of like the same that we have now. It's just like how to maintain the development that's happening in North Beach, right, on Collins Avenue, those gigantic beautiful buildings kind of thing, like how to maintain that kind of Miami image in those realities. And that's why this is like somewhere else. I know this is like a really far kind of thing to pull, but I actually think this is why the result of this feels like it's going 100 miles an hour toward a financialized solution for things, right? It's like, yeah, like there's no wonder why the ideas behind risk and speculation and financial investment becomes a primary tool for how to pay for that, right? Because when you can basically draw profit from another moment, right? And you use risk like climate change, like rising waters, and those to hedge bets on, then you can draw funds outside of tax bases. It's not far from the imagination. It's like Kim Stanley Robinson's basically model in that book. And yeah, I feel like more and more that's where, if anything, that's kind of where it's headed, because that is the closest line to the individual's, that's the closest sort of like line after the individual who builds his wall, his or her wall outside of her home, right, is that kind of investment. It's not like a scaled public collective solution. It's like, what does scaling up mean from that hyper individual perspective? It's a financialized one. It's like, how do you adapt the model of like the real estate selling model now to that? It's invest. So this is such bullshit way to think about this, but I'm gonna go back. So it's like going back to one of the, I'm not talking about original settlements here in Miami. I'm talking about like 1920s, let's say, like Glitz settlement here in Miami. Miami's always been built on like advertising and images. You know, it's just like this beautiful example of like sending postcards. People who arrived here and they would like send letters of like the paradise that they had found. I don't think, going back to what you were saying earlier, I don't think that mentality or that logic of the way in which image like builds here in Miami has changed. So I think from an individual perspective, like how you move from like the individual real estate investor who like builds, or the individual who builds their home and builds their own seawall, it's a selling tactic about these beautiful buildings in the ocean. You know, it's like the glitz of it doesn't go away because it doesn't look apocalyptic, right? Like by that image, at least the way in which it's sold doesn't look apocalyptic to people who have said it. They really don't. They don't think it looks or feels apocalyptic. Yeah. So yeah. I think that's the way it goes. It's just like an individual investment in that specific future. So that's it. I think that imagination of like escapism is one that is rooted, right? Like in your ability to escape, like your ability to mobilize outside of the situation is directly linked to like to your financial ability to do so, right? And I don't know what the psychology is of why, but I know what that looks like is the same as what it looks like in those like ranches up that are high up. It's the like it's the Bezos, right, with their escapist mentality to other planets, right? Like it both works in a super like speculative, hyperstitious kind of way, right? But it works in reality in terms of like even the isolation amongst the classes of just how starkly the lived experience is between people. What does it look like here? I mean, concrete, straight up concrete, it looks like 5 high-rises with like a gigantic mini like helicopter landing area on the rooftop, like with boats. I mean, it looks like somewhere between a Ballard and a Kim Stanley Robinson with nicer yachts. I don't think it's as degraded as the Ballardian version of it, and because it's sooner for me than the Kim Stanley Robinson version of it too. So that's one aspect of it. But it's already here. It's funny because a few years ago, like 2 years ago, when they were building this Renzo piano, this big building on 81st in Collins. It's like the one with the huge park outside. It's just gorgeous. Like, of course, like looks like an architectural rendering. I mean, they've become so good at rendering the images for these things that in concrete and in glass that it's really difficult to discern the difference between those two. And that's not, I mean, it's not a hyperbole because they're so good. So Domingo and I, a colleague, a friend of mine, Domingo Castillo, and we'd like to go to the sales center, and this is like time period when we're doing a lot of work thinking about these images and about architectural renderings and the future and everything. And they walk us through all of the beautiful elements and the different glass and like the natural like limestone and everything of the materials. And we just asked us like, what happens in a catastrophic, beyond category 5, or like what happens if the waters rise beyond, like, what are the scales at which you're building this for? And they're like, none of our clients for this building, none of our target audience for this building would worry about that. They wouldn't even be here during any of those moments. And we have a landing pad on the rooftop. So there is like the consideration of like what we think about, which is like, how do I get out of the garage, for example? Like, I don't know if that's what we think about. He's like, you know, the building is meant, you know, it's built to code and everything is category 5 resistant. He's like, but in terms of that, he's like, no, there's no one would stay here. You know, so we were, you know, this is I think right after I read 2140 or something, and I was like, there are generators in play. Like, what is this? He's like, yeah, of course, there's generators, but he's like, but like, it was so funny because it's like I had landed the wrong question actually, because he's just like, that doesn't matter to us. Like we're not even gonna be here. I mean, the Earth is huge. You can go anywhere. Well, shit blows over, and you're like, I'm so stupid. I just like projected my own position in doing it. Yeah, it's visible. It's honest here. Like that sounds. I don't mean honest in a good word. I mean it's like not the virtue, honesty. It's particularly because the city didn't go through that mid 20th century thing that New York went through. The city was built from the very beginning. Like, we may understand what neoliberalism is now, of the financialization of everything, you know, things and non-things, right? Thoughts and everything. But it was built on the sort of proto version of that. The city as we understand it now in the early 20th century was already kind of utilizing those mechanisms. And so, yeah, we didn't go through that here. So those stark differences between the classes and between what happens in the imagination that each one of these, let's just say groups of people, communities, or individuals have about the future is different without the qualms of like the lasting legacy, whether or not of an ideal or an image of like liberal ideals, right? Of some sort. They don't happen here. The customer was part of a closed door kind of thing that we were talking about. The conversation starts here, basically, for that group of people who we were talking to. The biggest problem you have to deal with in infrastructure, like on a scale of the close to 2 million people who live in this community, is how do you deal with shit, right? Like, it's really a sewer problem, right? You can't deal with it at a mass infrastructure level for that scale with water and gravity. It's like the sort of origin point of this conversation started was with shit. The solution is shit. It's really, and so mass amounts of people are going to have to be removed, and they're going to have to be migrated. They're going to have to migrate from this area. This is like the next part of the narrative. And then when they happily leave, then they're going to be super well adapted in other places that are not already overwhelmed by their own infrastructure and their own economic issues, right? They will leave. The people who will be left behind will be a combination of what's necessary, which is a high tax base, right? A labor class that serves that high tax base, and that's pretty much it. It's just those two things. So it's like serving class and upper class that pays for the infrastructure. And what's going to be left and usable of this area, because of the real infrastructure issues of how to deal with things like drinkable potable water and sewer, right, is going to be a limited amount. And it's also, and this is now leading somewhere where I don't know the specifics, but what is left of usable land that is high enough to be able to build higher up to put infrastructure into are like limited areas. And so they think that the 5 or 6 islands within this like marsh area, right, is the solution to that. And they imagine it as quite specifically 5 mini cities, vertical cities, that go up, also connected by bridges. I wonder, this is probably this thing that is circulating, by air and by highland, where they're self-contained. They're self-contained communities in there. And I remember in this conversation, like, it's like, well, let's talk about what the sellability of this is for that upper area, and it's like this will always be paradise. Like that's the bet, that this will always be paradise. What I find interesting is that skips the other narrative, which is that you could engineer yourself out of any problem, right? Which is actually a narrative that is like much more, I think, in line with this American, like U.S. American exceptionalism ingenuity kind of argument that dominated the 20th century, to like this like acceptance of it, but then falling for it in a completely different way. So, yeah, that's what it looks like to them. And so when you ask the two questions of like, how do you plan on getting all of these people out of this city? Happily. Where are you placing them? They should go to Atlanta, they said. I mean, this is like, they should go to Atlanta. Atlanta's the closest place.